The discovery of hundreds of suspected unmarked graves at a former residential school for Indigenous children in Canada made headlines in 2021. But while many around the world were shocked by the news, Canada's Indigenous people were not. They have long known about the damage these schools, designed to assimilate and strip Indigenous children of their identity, have caused to their communities. People in Power examines the long-term consequences of the residential school system and what's actually been done to right that historical wrong.
In schoolyards, churchyards and graveyards across Canada, a grim search is underway. Investigators are using ground-penetrating radar technology to look for evidence of what is now widely acknowledged as genocide.
I humbly stand before you to offer a long overdue apology.
A genocide perpetrated by the white settlers who founded this country against the Indigenous population who've lived here for more than 12,000 years.
We lost our families, we lost our siblings, our communities. Many lost their pride.
The Government of Canada now recognizes that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologize for having done this.
I was ashamed of who I was. I was ashamed of my family. I was ashamed of my people.
Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
In May 2021, Canadians were shocked at the discovery of 215 suspected unmarked graves at the site of a former state-sponsored residential school in British Columbia.
There are mass graves. The fact remains that there's our ancestors under the ground. And to get them home, we need resources, and we need the will of the federal government.
In the weeks and months that followed, more potential unmarked graves were found across the country.
So when the revelations came up about the children in unmarked graves, it was shocking to many Canadians. And they were driven by emotion. And they were sometimes surprised that we didn't have that same reaction. And the reason was because we've known for decades.
More than 130 residential schools operated across Canada. The aim was to isolate the children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture.
We know that thousands of children died in Indian residential schools. Sterilization happened en masse to Indigenous women. We know that there were outright mass murders.
You're taking children away from their parents and into a community where you're trying to transform them. That's genocidal.
It is genocide, in my view, clear and simple. It meets the United Nations definition of genocide, so I call it genocide.
In October 2022, parliamentarians unanimously passed a motion acknowledging a genocide had taken place on Canadian soil. Member of Parliament Leah Gazan said, "What happened in residential schools was a genocide. I'm grateful to parliamentarians who unanimously passed my motion, recognising the truth of Canada's history."
And when we talk about the scope of residential schools, this wasn't a one-off thing. This is pan-national, my friends. This goes from Halifax to Vancouver, 140 of them. This one closed down in 1997. This one closed down in 2003. This isn't ancient history. It's not in our rearview mirror. This is very present.
More than 150,000 children were forcibly taken from their homes between the 1880s and the late 1990s and placed in distant boarding schools. The schools were run by different churches, though the majority were operated by the Catholic Church. So far, the official number of children who died at the schools is 4,120. But it's believed many more lost their lives in the government-funded education system.
We as a society were all complicit. We supported the system that did this.
We're now boarding rows 30 to 40.
We're travelling from coast to coast to uncover how and why these schools existed, and to ask if, decades after the residential school system shut at its doors, the Canadian government is doing enough to support First Nations children, their families, and Indigenous communities overall.
There is this whole broad sweeping inequality that really acts as a prison for First Nations children and families, and really gets in the way of them being able to recover from the trauma of residential schools.
We get into and using the current is pushing your neck.
Life expectancy is 15 years less for Indigenous Canadians. Suicide rates are 5 times higher. And Indigenous communities have higher rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, and homelessness.
The legacy of genocide in Canada is felt every single day in every single Indigenous community. We see this in continued patterns of addiction and substance abuse, of child welfare, and of ongoing issues imposed by the government.
1 in 6 First Nations communities do not have clean drinking water. It means that you'll get 30 to 50% less in education funding. Maybe your kid's going to go to a mold-infested school. In child welfare, we had studies saying that it was 30% less than everyone else was getting, even though the need was higher because of residential schools.
There are more children in the child welfare system now than there were at the height of the residential schools. My suspicion is that Canada will not release this data that these calls to action are calling for, because it will illuminate their liability and the discrimination that they have been perpetuating.
Yeah, the government of Canada doesn't want to count what it could be held accountable for.
St. Mary's Residential School in Mission, British Columbia. Opened in 1863, this was the longest continuously operating residential school in Western Canada. Today it's the site of extensive searches using ground-penetrating radar.
Literally, the architecture tells a significant part of the narrative about the attitude, the mental constructs in the minds of the people that created these institutions, and how they were designed, built, and implemented, how they were administered, and for what reasons. Isolation, separation, control. It's all about the intent to do away with Indigenous peoples.
Dr. David Sheppy is leading the team surveying the site of this former residential school.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that always sort of shocks me a little bit about so many of these schools have their own cemetery in them.
This is a cemetery. It's a complicated situation because it's currently active. It's not just for children. It's unclear overall who exactly was buried there over time. But we do know that many of the markers are missing, and then so part of our job is to do our best to sort out what we know about burials in the cemetery.
Right now, Dr. Sheppy and his team are just one of dozens across Canada who are trying to piece together the grim legacy of Canada's residential school system. The work is slow and painstaking.
We look at archival information, we are looking at oral historical information, we're looking at all sorts of documentary information, we're looking at information that can come from the land itself through the application of technologies like drones and LiDAR mapping and ground-penetrating radar. We approach this in a very holistic manner.
The search at St. Mary's is still ongoing, but regardless of what is found, it's clear that these buildings and the people who worked in them have devastated this community.
Why I make art goes way back. When I was in residential school, grade 1, I already started being abused since I got there. So by April, it came Easter time, and their culture said, "Oh, we got to draw some rabbits." So I went and I drew a rabbit, and everybody just liked my drawing so much. At that age, at 6 years old, I decided, oh, I'm going to be an artist then. at that age. I'm going to create beauty for the people to see.
Sculptor Carl San was taken from his community when he was a small child. He says his experience at St. Mary's Residential School has shaped his entire life.
I got on a boat and all these kids were crying so hard, man. I had no idea what was going on, what I was getting into. Anyhow, we got shipped off to residential school there in Mission City there, called St. Mary's. Then nighttime came, and there wasn't a good environment there. There's the supervisors, the main guys there. They made us all line up to their bedroom, and they took us all in one by one, sexually abusing us every night. Every night, all of us kids who had to do that. That next day, that same man, he cut my hair. I remember sitting on this, they call it the barber chair, sitting there, and I could smell him so bad. It makes me sick if I smell chopped hair now.
Deprived of his language and culture, subjected to hard labor and sexual abuse, Carl fell into alcoholism and drug abuse.
I didn't know why I was drinking so much, because I had really drowned out what had happened to me in school. I had really drowned it out.
More and more survivors are now speaking out about the abuses they endured at St. Mary's Residential School.
Yeah, sadly, my research shows that there were pedophiles and physical abusers and sadistic, mentally cruel people who were mentally cruel in the school systems throughout the last 80, 90 years. It's very, very clear.
Well, if I had grown up in my community, I would have learned the language. I would have learned how to hunt and fish, and learn about the ceremonies that we had in place.
Do you regret that?
Oh, heck yeah, because I can't teach my children all of those things. I was sexually abused. It wasn't by a priest or brother, it was by one of them. First incident was by an older boy, and the second time was a boy similar to my age, but still didn't make it right anyway.
I remember the awful loneliness, the feeling abandoned and mistreated, like we were nothing. We were really taught that we were stupid, ignorant, and that we had nothing to offer within society. And that's today, sadly, a lot of our people still suffer that.
Because we were displaced, we had to, our homes had to move. And then the children were taken. A lot of them went to residential school. But in our community, a lot of people moved. A lot of people moved away. They went to the States. They went just to different places. And so it was a hardship for our people, and like Dee said, that there weren't any children, so you lose your way, and a lot of drinking took place.
All my family members, from the oldest to the youngest, I had 5 brothers and 3 sisters, and we were all alcoholics, and my siblings, they took all of their stories to the grave with them, and they never did get out of alcoholism, so that was one of the toughest things about trying to be a family, because we didn't talk to each other about whatever happened to us.
A lot of our men just lost their way because of the abuses that happened with them. And all of that came out years later. And they're still living that, and then we've lost so many of them. In our own families, we all know of a relative that was abused, that from drinking or the drugs or suicide.
In 2015, Canada elected Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister. Trudeau promised to reset the relationship with Canada's Indigenous communities and respect their rights.
Trudeau promised us everything. He thought he could change everything. He thought he could make things better. And I was, yay, Trudeau, yay, I hope he wins. And Peter sitting beside me on the couch. He won't be able to do anything. He listens to dusty old men in dusty old offices.
He said it was going to be a priority for him. And I think probably in his heart, that's what he thought was going to be his priority. But when he got into power, there are massive lobby groups.
The same year Trudeau was elected, the federal government received a report from an independent Truth and Reconciliation Commission, part of an agreement to settle multiple lawsuits brought by former residential school students.
It is important for Canadians to start somewhere and ultimately to create those tools of reconciliation that will live beyond today.
Justice Murray Sinclair's report on the findings of the Commission identified systemic failings and abuses that took place in the residential school system and put forward 94 calls to action to right its many wrongs. But 8 years later, researchers say only 13 calls to action have been fulfilled.
And we've been finding each year that there's been very minimal progress, that there's been almost a glacial pace.
The federal government told me in a statement, collaboration is ongoing across our government to identify the necessary steps to accelerate implementation, address systemic challenges hindering progress, and involve all partners. Indigenous people are poorer, sicker, less educated, more prone to alcoholism and drug abuse, more likely to be homeless, and die sooner than the rest of Canada's population.
You know, we are some of the poorest people in this country, and we actually should be the richest, because all of the resources that are extracted from our lands contribute incredible wealth to this country.
We're travelling down through British Columbia to Victoria, where the province's Minister for Indigenous Affairs has granted us an interview. Murray Rankin is the man responsible for British Columbia's Indigenous communities.
You can't manage something if you don't measure it. And we have metrics we've agreed upon with the First Nation leadership to manage and describe specific actions that need to be taken. We're the only jurisdiction in North America to have approved the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which is our roadmap.
So, I mean, speaking about metrics, though, I mean, unfortunately, Indigenous communities kind of lead the way in, you know, the metrics such as rates of suicide, of alcoholism, of sort of health outcomes. How big of a challenge is it going to be to kind of get those metrics where they should be?
It's an enormous challenge, and those negative metrics, if I can call it that, are all too true. And we all agree as a society that we need to do much, much better. This is the legacy of colonialism. We all know that to be true. We're trying to take steps to empower Indigenous communities, self-determination, self-government. These are the things we think will make a difference, but we do have an enormous way to go.
So imagine being an adult in a community where there are no kids. Like that's what it looks like. And imagine that happening for over 100 years to your kids. And then when they close, the government says, you know what? We're going to give you less help than everybody else to overcome that legacy. And then when you fail to be able to look after the kids to the same standards as everybody else, we're going to send in child welfare and we're going to remove your kids again, even at higher rates. That's what's happened.
We're heading now to the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. This was one of Canada's oldest and longest-running residential schools. Opened in 1831, it was only closed in 1970.
This place was full of predators. So not only were these children taken from their community, not only were they put in a strange land with strange languages, they were put around some of the most reprehensible adults you can imagine. And I want to show you this room. Not to glorify it, but to educate you guys on how horrible this place could be at sometimes. So This is the boiler room, the infamous Mohawk Institute boiler room. When this thing was going, it would have been so loud. And the reason that this is a room of regret is because of the sound, because it was away from the school, this is where a lot of the sexual abuse happened. And again, when the children knew, when they were tapped on the shoulder and told to come here, it just must have been such an ominous feeling for them, knowing what was waiting ahead. So if you want to go, you can. I'm going to stay at the doorway.
The Mohawk Institute is more than 4,000 kilometres away from St. Mary's School, but the stories here are depressingly similar. Like so many schools from coast to coast, this was an institution where neglect, abuse, and child labour were commonplace.
When I hear the term residential school, it actually makes me angry. There was no learning going on. It was a work camp. A number of the staff were also predators. The Canadian government did a study, and they wanted to know how many predators were throughout the 140 residential schools that existed, and the answer was close to 6,000. Only 50 faced justice.
Why don't you knock them down?
Why did we knock Auschwitz down? And the reason is because it's a place of conscience. So if we are never to repeat the events of history, we must learn from them. So as part of that, they're doing ground penetrating radar with the Survivor Secretariat, and that's what these grids are. And that's happening at a lot of residential schools today. If Canada is sincere and genuine about reconciliation, help us bring our kids home. So part of that is by doing ground penetrating radar. We talked about the federal government, what they can do. Put some resources into this, right your wrong. You know, all we're trying to do is get to the truth. And the truth is there weren't mass murdering sites, but there are mass graves, right? And there's a difference in that. And however we want to peel that onion, the fact remains that there's our ancestors under the ground. And to get them home, we need resources, and we need the will of the federal government, so.
In 2016, Canada adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it was enshrined into law in 2021. Once implemented, the declaration would give Indigenous people more control over their lands, greater protection of their language and culture, and more political representation. But the communities I talk to say the words of the politicians in Ottawa aren't backed up by concrete actions.
I don't think there's any trust whatsoever. I don't think that there's good enough reason to have trust that Canada is coming to reconciliation in good faith, particularly when they've fought so hard against the most vulnerable members of our community, and that is children.
I am always reflective on the fact it took an international news story, which Kamloops became, to really spur the government to act.
In March 2023, UN Special Rapporteur Jose Francisco Khalid-Sai highlighted the appalling legacy of the residential school system on a visit to Canada. He called on the government to work more closely with Indigenous communities.
Every ministry in our government has a piece of the action, and those actions are meaningful. They're tangible, they're concrete, they're not pie in the sky. They're things that we can measure and point to, which we hope will make a difference.
As ground-penetrating radar work continues all across this vast country, more uncomfortable truths about the residential school system will emerge.
Those long threads of injustice from residential school, they continue to be woven forward in Canadian society to the detriment of First Nations children, but to the detriment of the Canadian country as well.
This is a process that will take potentially decades. This is children, these are missing children, and a child's life is priceless. And these nations really want to bring these children home.
When Canadians pay attention and demand action, it happens. When they fall asleep, children die.